it's not one that you share for sure. But I think the point is that the way we think about things changes much more than we imagine, mean different things in different contexts, more than we actually appreciate. And what I'm trying to do is engage in a conversation that explores those questions and does not say that I have the truth about this, because the whole point is to understand that none of us in this life do more than see through the glass darkly.
Yes, I'm not sure the way you're responding to me, though, is helping your case. Because here's the thing: I teach history of dogma, so I mean, like, the history of a belief in the beatific vision or heaven would be a thing I'm rather familiar with, or
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't want to miss you here. So.
I just think that you would need to concede, though, that there's some kind of commitment to perennial truth. My concern about the way that you formulated your response, let me say what I think would be the weakness of it. It would not compel me to commit to any kind of hope, even in the future, of a consensus around topics of justice or human dignity, because I could do the same kind of, I could run the same kind of account about the plurality of, the historicity of views of justice or plural. I mean, the problematics of relativism and postmodernism and perspectivalism, if you begin to start the historical story to try to delimit convictions in one domain, be it dogmatic, but then try to save it in another domain, be it moral, political, anthropological, you're still going to have to give some kind of account of how over time there's the hope of common consensus about convictions. And it seems that you could say, well, I just want to do that in civic society, but I don't want Christians doing that among themselves, because then they'll fight with each other. Well, I mean, it seems to me if we can do it on a civic level, then we also can do it in an interreligious level and in an ecclesial level, with limitations. But you know, we won't always agree about everything. But we are trying to find common truth convictions over time. And it seems to me, yes, the Trinity certainly is controversial to many, but I didn't say that it alleviates all conflict. I just mean that over time the community or communities can try to articulate common convictions that are broadly unifying. And it seems like that Christian dogma as well as common philosophy are some of the ways we do that, which I think is a rather modest claim, but maybe we disagree on that.
I think probably the place where we're looking at it from a different perspective is really the idea that we can, in principle, get to a point where there is some kind of consensus, or the perspective that says, actually, in principle, we can't entirely. Because there are quite fundamental differences of culture and the way we perceive things. And I guess that's, to some extent, they're almost articles of faith, you know, where one says, well, I think we can. That's a perfectly reasonable place to come from. And another that says, well, I'm not sure that we can, even in principle. So it's not so much. So, for example, a little bit like the problem that's been created by Heisenberg, where actually it's not a question of us not being able to measure certain things accurately because we don't yet have the technology. It is that in principle, it's not possible to measure two different things. I remember many years ago, a very old friend of mine who left school and went to Cambridge, and he's never appeared out. And he's now the head of physical sciences in Cambridge. And I was trying to explain to him how I was having a real struggle trying to get a model in my head to understand wave and particle. And he just laughed at me and said, of course you can't get a model in your head. These are just the outcomes of mathematical formulae. There aren't any models that we can construct that actually we in our heads can understand, because it's beyond what we can understand. And I think in a sense that was what I was saying, that it seems to me that there is a wish, and it's a reasonable wish, and to some extent one can hope and have the faith that we can reach this, and that's be part of the driver for a certain kind of approach to interfaith engagement. Or there's another posture which says, actually, I'm not sure that we can, and in fact, what we need to do is look at it in a different kind of way, which is more like parables. So that, for example, you say, well, look, you want to look through a pane of glass, not darkly, but brightly. And I want to say, actually, it's not like a pane of glass, it's like a diamond that has to have a whole lot of different facets shown up, and those facets will face different directions, otherwise it won't sparkle at all. It's different perspectives on the thing, which is what stimulates a conversation rather than a conflict.
That's very helpful.
So thank you for doing it.
Please. Yes, we are coming to the end. So maybe two more questions.
I very much enjoyed your talk. But as I was listening to what you were saying, just my perception, you gave kind of a definition of religion. You gave a number of sort of definitions, and I got the sense that as I was thinking about what you said, that at least some of your definitions would apply to philosophy, as Father's kind of touched on it, because when I think of religion, I think of not just the natural law or things that we can agree upon on the natural level, but things that are revealed, and also a certain set of beliefs. If you talk about certain things we hold in common, and philosophy is an attempt to understand reality. And certainly we can build on that. And it seemed like a lot of what you were saying about religion seemed to be applying more to philosophy rather than to religion. I wonder if you could maybe clarify that for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question, because it maybe helps me to point up something kind of quite fundamental about what I was trying to say. Nowadays, in university life, everything is separated off into silos. It's all split off into a whole lot of different specialisms of all kinds. Used to be, you were a doctor, well, you might be a physician or a surgeon. And then you got all sorts of other specialties and subspecialties to do with age and particular parts of the body and so on and so on. And every area of life now is separated off into all these different approaches to things, to the point where if you try to get a university grant to do research on a piece of work that transgresses over, say, law, theology, engineering, and climate science, you won't get the grant. Because the people who are looking at it will say, oh, this is just muddled thinking, we're pure, we have to keep within these boundaries. And actually, people are ending up, as is often said, knowing more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing at all. The point that I was making is that in the old days, there wasn't philosophy and religion and anthropology and all. It was about the study of human beings and how they engaged with each other, with themselves, and with the universe in which they lived. We've tried specializing and splitting it down, and there is advantage in that. There's no question that we have been able to take our understanding forward, our technology, our way of doing things. My wife was a histopathologist, my brother is a dermatologist, my sister-in-law is a pediatrician. All completely different aspects of medicine. And because it's been separated into these specialisms, my brother knows far more about skins than I will ever know. But he doesn't know as much about the mind. So when he's got somebody that's got a problem with their skin because they're upset, he will often have to talk with myself, and so on. Now, that we can have those relationships is important. And I don't, as I say, think that specialization was a mistake or wrong or whatever. But it has its limits. And one of its limits is that we don't have a broader picture of things. What I'm trying to do and what I'm saying is, this is all about human beings as a whole and our engagement with all of us and all the others outside and the whole of the multiverse in which we engage. and however you want to describe that, and some people will put the word God to it, and some people will have some other kind of thought about it, and so on. So the idea of splitting philosophy off and saying, oh, that's philosophy, and this is religion, it's totally understand it, and there's a certain degree of merit in it. But in a sense, I'm trying to go the opposite direction and say, let's try to pull these things together. The other thing I would say about it is, one of the problems about the specialization is that it becomes increasingly difficult for somebody to take a different approach within that specialism. One of the problems for Isaiah Berlin, when he went into philosophy in Britain, was that philosophy was dominated by approaches like logical positivism. And he discovered he couldn't get to speak at a conference or publish in a journal or whatever. And this is also true, by the way, nowadays in other kinds of ways. So he went off into the study of the history of ideas. Because in a way, he kind of went round the corner. And then he was able to write about philosophy on the basis he was writing about the history of ideas, rather than nowadays. And one of the great problems is, with the specialization, becomes an iron grip on what you can actually believe and do and say. And this is one of the things that has kept many religious people out of all sorts of aspects of academic life, because certain ways of thinking about religion and faith are now regarded as beyond the academic and intellectual pale in certain areas. And that's, to me, one of the struggles. I don't go with postmodernism at all, but one of the advantages of that way of thinking, it seems to me, is that it gives a potential route back into the debate, because it's been discovered that actually if you simply exclude these things, you exclude what is of most value. I mean, one of the frustrations for me in psychiatry, for example, in doing research, was that the only things you could do double-blind crossover trials on were things that didn't matter to anybody at all. You can't do a double-blind crossover trial on whether or not your wife still loves you. You know? All you can do is try to observe as best you can and interpret as best you can and test things out. But you can't do a scientific trial of it. And you can't do a scientific trial on the vast majority of things that are really important to human beings. So what that tells us is science is very useful in its own place, but it can't answer all the questions. And we need to find a way of bringing those important questions back in. And faith is one of these hugely important aspects that we need to find a way of coming back in to the debate. And that's, I'm more trying to put my arms around it than slice it up. So thanks for the question.
So I think, let me ask one of the last question, because your practice is focused on resolving intractable conflicts. In fact, resolving intractable conflicts is kind of a very special version of a fundamental question, the political philosophy. What's a common denominator which helps people live together, although they share completely different opinion on things they consider as existential? The long tradition from, I don't know, Aristophanes' Clouds to John Locke is that they can have any opinion on anything, but they should be believers. I mean, that the only element which is conditio sine qua non of being citizens or of giving hope to resolve if the intractable conflict appears is that belief in two things. First, they share beliefs that objective absolute truth exists. And secondly, I think, at least at the same level of importance, they do agree, and it's the same thought from Aristophanes to Locke, they do agree that their knowledge is incomplete. That's a kind of, because we usually share that first opinion when we talk about it, but the second is at least the same importance. So the second aspect is a kind of religious skepticism, let's call it. Religious because it's connected with an opinion of absolute truth, but it creates an approach which make a hypothesis that my opinion is, say, not perfect, possible. Do you agree, that's first question, with that tradition? And if not, what's a common denominator for you? I mean, when you as a person who did it, when your opinion is that there is no chance for resolving agreement, and why?
It seems to me that when you've got people who have quite different beliefs about what the good is, if you focus on those disagreements and how to reach an accommodation of those disagreements, you're probably doomed to the intractability of the problem. So if, for example, you had said to Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, well, forget about this United Ireland stuff, it's causing all sorts of trouble, just forget about all of that and we'll try to sort things out. Or if you say to the Palestinians, look, you're never going to have a state, stop annoying yourselves about it, let's just try to get better socioeconomic terms. You won't succeed. It absolutely doesn't work. And you might say, well, that's pretty hopeless then. Well, no. What we began to do, having tried all sorts of things over history, not particularly just me personally, was that everything we tried failed. And then we started looking at the relationships between the communities. So the Irish peace process was not based on looking at borders, looking at policing, administration of justice as primary things. The primary thing was to say, what are the important historic disturbed relationships? And those were between Protestants and Catholics, Unions and Nationalists in the north, between people in the north and people in the south, and between Britain and Ireland. And the process of engagement in the peace process itself had three strands representing those relationships. And when we reached an agreement, it had three sets of institutions that reflected those separate strands. The key thing was relationships. It wasn't beliefs. It wasn't even visions of the future. It was about the relationships. Now, the importance of that is this. If you think that you need to basically have the same fundamental beliefs in order to have any kind of peaceful relationship, then you're likely to be in trouble in all sorts of circumstances, including with the next generation, because they won't believe the same things, even if they use the same words. They come out of a different context, and they don't see the thing in the same kind of way. But you can still have a relationship. Now, this is really important in lots and lots of ways, but let me give you a couple of examples. One of the sets of views that is around about extremism, like Boko Haram, is that the problem is that these people have extreme beliefs. And what you have to do is moderate their beliefs. There's no evidence we're able to do that at all. I take a different view. I think the problem isn't extreme beliefs, it's extreme feelings. People can believe all sorts of things, but they don't necessarily act on them. And if I was to say to you, how many of you believe in heaven? Well, most of you put your hands up. I said, how many of you want to go there? Most of you put your hands up. I say, how many of you would like to go there this afternoon? You say, well, hang on, I'm not in a big rush. Right? Because you believe something doesn't necessarily mean you act immediately on it. But if you passionately get engaged with it, then a trigger can suddenly spring you off. And that's one of the problems about people that get involved in terrorism, when people say, oh my goodness, I never realized there was anything like that. Because beliefs tend to change over a little while, but feelings can change like that. Something happens and suddenly you're fired. So it seems to me that it's about feelings more than beliefs. The second thing is that it's about relationships between people and peoples. And that's the bit that needs to be healed. And that people don't need to believe the same things, don't need to have the same kinds of ambitions at all. But it's still possible to have relationships between people and communities. And what I found myself doing was trying to establish a personal relationship with people on the unionist side, with people on the nationalist side, with people who used violence, with people who didn't use violence. and engage in that relationship and try to draw people forward into relationship in all sorts of practical ways and discussions and so on and so on and so on. Now, the place where you might relate that to the intellectual developments of the last 30 years or so is the development of complexity science. Complexity science is essentially a study of the relationships of things, not of the individual things themselves. Because what Heisenberg discovered was you can't study the individual things with any degree of certainty because they're always shifting and moving. So what's the importance of that? If you go into Israel-Palestine, you will have a profound attraction, depending on your individual background, to support one side or the other. You know, you'll instinctively feel sympathetic to Palestinians or sympathetic to Jewish Israelis. And then you're just part of the problem. Because that's what the problem is. The problem is this great split. But if you go into it and you say, the problem is the relationship, the disturbed historic relationship between these communities of people, and that's what I have to engage with, is the relationship, not one side or the other. Then you bring something different to the party. Then it becomes possible to engage with it in a different kind of way. So that's why. So it's not that beliefs aren't important; they are. It's not that you simply have some mishmash of beliefs. That's why I'm not really that impressed with things like multiculturalism and relativism and so on. I think it's perfectly appropriate that people have their different beliefs. That you have a belief, I have a different, other people have different beliefs. That's absolutely fine, and that gives us the opportunity of conversing with each other and exploring and developing and changing and all of those kinds of things. But we can still have a relationship with each other in which we engage respectfully with each other as human beings. And our communities can do that too. And that is driven by, modified by how we feel more even than how we think about things, potentially. And so that's the approach that I found myself taking. And when we've done that, it has opened possibilities that were not there before. Thanks for the question, Derek.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sorry. We have to stop our discussion. We are living in the world of many intractable conflicts which divide our society. So thank you very much for that important input from the point of view of a person who practically resolve at least one extremely and perceived as absolutely intractable conflict. Thank you very much for your presence on the first JP2 lecture in that academic year. Thank you very much for our speaker. I invite you for a lecture of Jean-Luc Marion. It will be a next subject, and thank you very much, and you all please feel invited to our exhibition. Bye.